Hey, 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 fellow truth seekers. Happy Tuesday after a beautiful long weekend of Labor Day, and welcome back to the Isabel Brown Show. We've got a big week ahead of us covering some crazy big developing stories from all over the world, and today is no exception as we talk about last week's insanely bizarre new Surgeon General's health warning for adults that parenting is the latest hazard to your health, why everyone is up in arms over IVF, over comments made over the last few days by presidential candidates and certain political parties, and where you should be asking bioethical questions about the practice, and more. We've got a stellar lineup of the show waiting for you today. So without further ado, let's jump in. But first, you know the drill. Don't forget to smash that follow or subscribe button wherever you guys are watching to help us grow one person at a time. We just surpassed our 1 million community member mark over on Instagram, which I am so excited about. So shout out everyone watching over on the Insta Gs, and big development from over the weekend. We are verified on TikTok and we'll start streaming over there very soon as well. So lots of fun developments in the streaming world. How excited I am to see our community continue to grow. Okay, all of that to be said, let's kick things off. As you guys know, I've heard probably the most insane string of arguments or pathetic, hollow statements attempting to get people to not want to have children over the last several years. I've said it before and I'll say it again, easily one of the largest components of America's real war on women that is happening, unfolding before our eyes over the last several years and into the 2020s has been the strategic indoctrination happening generationally for millennials and Gen Z to convince young women that they should never want to become a mother. We've heard a million people say this in different ways, from AOC trying to convince you that children are going to destroy the environment and you hate all of humanity if you would so unreasonably bring a child into a world that's going to literally end in 12 years. You hear people say that children ruin their personal life and they publish op-eds about this. Can you even imagine being one of these people's children, by the way? It just genuinely would break my heart, to be honest with you. But that you don't have fun anymore, you don't get to have friends anymore, you don't get to have casual sex all the time anymore. I've even seen people argue about this from a corporate perspective, which I think is probably the most effective way our culture is trying to strategically convince women not to have children, that their identity is inherently tied to their career. And because their career is one of the most, if not the most important things about them, they will lose the opportunity to continue climbing the corporate ladder because kids ruin the rest of your life. So why would you ever want to do that? Which, frankly, I find wildly insulting to women, as if you can't have children and a career at the same time, which is pathetic and misogynistic and actually sexist. But really, it's just a convenient way for a lot of these companies and woke corporate CEOs to rather pay for a one-time out-of-state abortion trip, for example, than better maternity leave policies. I digress, different conversation for a different time. So we hear kids are going to destroy the environment. We hear kids destroy your job, kids destroy your personal life. But I have yet to see a coherent argument until this point convincing women largely not to have children because of your health until now. This is from the Wall Street Journal, okay? Who is supposed to be generally reputable news, but welcome to 2024, where the mainstream media is just dead. There is a new Surgeon General's warning that came out last week that parenting is now hazardous to your health. So if you want to live a healthy lifestyle as a grown-up, parenting should not be on your list of to-dos. Parenting is hazardous to your health. When I saw this headline, I genuinely just wanted to blow my brains out, to be honest with you. But I did some more digging, and I'm actually quite interested in what the Surgeon General has to say. They're issuing a new hazardous health warning over parenthood because they're trying to make the argument that parenting is dangerous or bad to the mental health of an adult. Let me just say up front that I 100% empathize with people who have additional stressors in their life and the mental health crisis that's happening in our country right now, particularly for Generation Z, who's experiencing the single most serious, unprecedented mental health crisis of all time. And no one really knows what to do about it because we only seem to keep feeding into it. But I find it fascinating and very telling that most of the people in positions of power today are trying to make you believe that what's destroying your mental health is actually the thing that could probably save it. This being a prime example. The argument that the U.S. Surgeon General, who, if you don't know, or you might be watching from another country, is like America's doctor. This is the doctor of the President of the United States. It's a huge honor, big deal to be named the Surgeon General. The argument that the Surgeon General, Dr. Vivek Murthy, is trying to make is that parenthood makes you lonely and therefore is destroying your mental health, citing a report from the American Psychological Association in the process of issuing this gigantic warning, everyone be forewarned. The American Psychological Association said that half of parents report overwhelming stress most days, compared with 26% of other adults. Half of parents report overwhelming stress most days, which when I told my mother about this Surgeon General's warning, her exact response, I believe, was, no shit, Sherlock's. Like, duh, obviously, parents are dealing with some overwhelming stress every single day. But that doesn't discount the fact that 26%, more than a quarter of all other adults who are not parents, are also dealing with overwhelming amounts of stress every day. So this seems more like a correlation, not a causational study being unfolded here, but that's not how it's portrayed in the media. And they also are trying to make the argument that parents are overwhelmingly lonelier. According to one study done by one health insurance company, Cigna, in 2021, making the argument that 65% of parents said they were lonely, compared with 55% of people without children. So the majority in both situations are reporting loneliness in our extremely disconnected, constantly divided, vitriolic, angry society. I don't know that that has much to do with parenting so much as it speaks volumes about where our society is today in just how broken and divided and angry we are. But that's not stopping the top doctor in the United States of America, several medical organizations like the American Psychological Association and the mainstream media all across the board rallying around this narrative that parenting is bad for your health. Period. Full stop. Again, everyone is struggling with mental health these days. Everyone is struggling with anxiety and depression and loneliness to some degree. Many at a severe, alarming rate, far more than we ever expected, still in the wake of the isolation we all experienced and the loneliness we all experienced through COVID. But it feels to me, and maybe this is just my opinion, so I'm curious what you guys think, drop it in the chat. It seems to me that the powers that be, government, big pharma, big insurance, big media, etc., are going out of their way to find a new justification for why our society is so broken. They've run out of other things to blame this on, and they refuse to blame this on what I think are the real reasons this loneliness and isolation are happening. So naturally, they have to try to blame it on something good. And when I say good, I don't mean easy. No part of parenthood is an easy journey or an easy experience. I'm not a parent yet. I very much hope to be someday, so I don't want to speak as an expert on the subject, but every single person I've ever known who has had children tells me it's the hardest journey they've ever gone through, but the most rewarding and the most purpose-driven and the most beautiful journey they ever could have asked for in their life, that they truly didn't even know who they were until they had the opportunity to have a child and see the world through fresh eyes, through their eyes. I'm getting choked up just thinking about it because that's just such a beautiful concept. That's not to say it's easy. And of course, it's stressful. But that in and of itself is not what is hazardous to your health, contrary to what the powers that be are obviously trying to get you to believe. Is it at all possible that parenting might actually be a positive antidote to the insane brokenness that our society is experiencing? Could something like parenting be, in fact, a pathway to purpose, to meaning, to identity in our empty, broken, divided world? And, tinfoil hat moment, is it at all possible that the people in positions of power today, government, pharma, insurance, media, pop culture, entertainment, and more, are trying to make you more miserable, more unhealthy, more lonely and anxious and depressed and suicidal by making you believe that what could be the cure is actually the disease? Because you never, ever, ever, ever see the media suggesting that our ridiculously overprocessed and, let's face it, poisonous food is contributing to the nation's mental health epidemic. No. In fact, you'll see the media go out of their way to gaslight you into believing that our food, even though it's overprocessed, is actually super good for you, as we saw with Time magazine last week in the wake of RFK's presidential campaign suspension speech. Have you ever seen the media go out of their way to tell you that maybe, just maybe, the insane political division that's being perpetrated by the media might be destroying some people's brains with derangement syndromes of some kinds, and that constantly keeping you on edge over the most outrageous, insane, manufactured stories to keep you watching, to keep you reading, because that's how these companies make money, that might be fueling your anxiety, your depression, your suicidation, your loneliness and isolation from your community. No, because that's how they make money. They're never, ever, 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 ever in a million years going to admit to something like that. To the point that the media will tell you, oh yeah, that guy that you just watched get shot on TV a few months ago, he wasn't actually shot because we just don't believe our own eyeballs anymore. Would you ever see the media go out of their way to say the fact that we have the lowest marriage rate in American history since the time we began recording marriage rates in the 1860s might be contributing to our loneliness, to our isolation, to our anxiety, to our depression, to our suicidation? And that maybe modern culture's attack on committed, monogamous, lifelong love, because that's so outdated, that's so patriarchal, that's so anti-feminist, maybe that is a bad thing. No. Instead, you see the media put forward the single most outrageous headlines you've ever seen in your life about polyamory and why you should never get married or commit. And you see it from both sides of the political aisle as well, with powerful, powerful voices in the media trying to gaslight you into thinking getting hitched is the end of your life. So this headline, as outrageous as it is, and the fact that this is actually a medical health hazard warning from the Surgeon General, shouldn't even surprise me. But I do think their tactics are getting more obvious. And this is why I have hope, to be honest. Because even though this infuriates me and totally pisses me off, as every single power that be, the proverbial they that's running our society, pulling all the strings of power in the media, in politics, in medicine, in food, in entertainment, in Hollywood, in education, in the church, everywhere, even though all these people are pulling the power strings and getting a little more outrageous every single day, the fact that it is this obvious and the fact that something like this generated as much outrage as it did quite quickly on social media tells me they are overplaying their hand. That people are waking up. And nothing, honestly, could excite me more in the process. Because the more they say the quiet part out loud, the more they tell you that they want you to be fat. They want you to be obese so that they can sell you pharmaceuticals because they want you to be sick forever in perpetuity. They want you to be lonely and not committed to anyone in your love life for the rest of your life because you are more vulnerable and easier to control if you are a unit of one instead of a unit of two or more in your family. They want you to not be able to have children, which is why they're shoving birth control in the hands of 10-year-olds today or even younger, and why they're strategically putting things all over society. I'll have to be careful about what I'm saying right now to destroy fertility in both men and women. Look at the graphs of testosterone decline in the last several decades and sperm production. Look at the number of spontaneous miscarriages that are happening in pregnancies. Look at the number of women who need to use IVF to conceive a child because of unexplained infertility. I can't tell you how many of my friends are walking through unexplained infertility right now that on paper it looks like everything is working, but it's not working because they want you to be childless. Then you become a better worker. You become a more outraged, even if it's manufactured, political participant. You become easier to control. And they want you to forsake God in the process, because if you don't worship God, you'll be more likely to worship the proverbial they, the powers that be. And what are the things that bring us closer to the divine? I don't know, things like providing a meal for a loved one with real food that you made yourself. Family brings us closer to the divine, the ability to grow life inside of you and participate in the godly experience of creating something from scratch. That brings you closer to the divine. To selflessly lay your life down for another human being for the rest of your life, saying, I vow to put you above me forever. That brings us closer to the divine. And it has never been more obvious to me that they want you to forsake not just what's going to make you happy and healthy, but what's going to tie you to something bigger than yourself. Because when you are hopeless, when you are isolated, when you are lonely, when you are unhealthy, when you are at the end of your rope, that is when you are the easiest to manipulate and to control. So, simple solution, don't let them control you. You are under no obligation to buy into the lies of the media and the government. And in fact, if you still are at this point, I am praying for your soul because it is time for all of us to wake up and realize just how loud the quiet part is getting. On a separate note, IVF is back in the headlines early this week after Donald Trump said in an interview on the campaign trail something particularly controversial. We'll get to this clip that I found on Twitter from MJ Truth Ultra here in just a second, but to give you guys a brief overview in case you are like, what the heck is this girl talking about? IVF is an acronym that stands for in vitro fertilization. We've done 2 streams in the last 6 months or so, really diving into the nitty-gritty specifics of IVF, and I highly, highly encourage you to check all of them out. We had some really interesting conversations, and we went back and forth on the bioethical implications of everything. We took your guys' comments from the chat. I think you absolutely should watch them if you haven't already, because I give you a lot of insight into why I find IVF a very morally gray area and why it's something that we need to continue conversating about, because that's the only way we can move forward productively as a society, ethically and taking care of one another. But this has all kind of gotten wrapped up in the political conversation throughout this presidential campaign cycle, particularly after Donald Trump has weighed in the last several days, and IVF being a centerpiece of the Kamala Harris campaign tied in with abortion is trying to convince women that all women are going to literally die. You're never going to be able to have children, even though they are quite literally telling us that they don't want us to have children at the same time. LOL, how you can see the double standard play out in real time there. And basically, if you are a woman, if you want to have kids or you don't want to have kids, either way, the only person that you're allowed to vote for is Kamala Harris. And basically, Donald Trump hates you, hates your health care, and wants to take away all of your reproductive rights. In the meantime, Trump really shook up the American political zeitgeist in the last few days related to reproductive health care actual reproductive health care. We're not just talking about the euphemism for abortion there. And I'm really curious to know what you guys think of this. This announcement has now been clarified and rehashed and talked about a million times, but basically it all started with Donald Trump speaking to a reporter on the campaign trail about IVF, in vitro fertilization, and saying this.
And what we're doing, and we're doing this because we just think it's great, and we need great children, beautiful children in our country. We actually need them. And we are going to be, under the Trump administration, we are going to be paying for that treatment. So we are paying for that treatment.
All Americans who want it?
All Americans that get it, all Americans that need it. So we're going to be paying for that treatment, or we're going to be mandating that the insurance company pay.
Let's watch it again because I want you not to miss anything. I agree with the whole first part of what Donald Trump is saying here. Our country needs beautiful children. We are literally not replacing our current population, so we need people, period. But we also need to revive the American family. We need to incentivize people to have kids. Totally 100,000% agree with that sentiment. I don't necessarily love where the conversation is going after that, though.
And we're doing this because we just think it's great, and we need great children, beautiful children in our country. We actually need them. And we are going to be, under the Trump administration, we are going to be paying for that treatment. So we, the Trump administration, aka the federal government, are going to be paying for IVF. In case it's not incredibly obvious to you based on the endless conversations we have about who really pays for things when the government is paying for something, that's us. That's taxpayers. That is your tax dollars going to fund in vitro fertilization. Or paying for that treatment.
All Americans who want it?
All Americans that get it, all Americans that need it. So we're going to be paying for that treatment, or we're going to be mandating that the insurance company pay.
Or we will be mandating that the insurance company pay for your IVF treatment. Any American who wants it. Ooh. Let's put bioethics aside for a moment on why people are so uncomfortable with the practice of IVF, why the Catholic Church has been universally against the practice of IVF since its inception about 40 years ago, why largely there is a pro-life element wrapped into all of this, and what constitutes life and who is worthy of the right to life, all people. Let's just put that aside for a second, and I want to share with you some takes that I saw from fellow content creators on Twitter over the last several days about this, because it's really made me think about Trump's statement in an entirely new way. First and foremost, I'm so glad that the former president of the United States, my former boss when I interned at the White House in 2018, is tuned into the fact that there is a direct, obvious, vicious, vile, evil attack on the unit of the family in the United States of America today. We just covered that in the first half of the show based on this new Surgeon General's warning. And he's absolutely right. We do need beautiful children. The most beautiful children in all of the world come from America. We do. We need more children. We need healthy children. And I think he's getting a lot of this language and this excitement from other people who ran for president along these lines and on these issues that are now in his ear advising him on what issues Americans are facing every day. And largely, I think that's coming from Vivek Ramaswamy and from RFK, who has been wildly outspoken about the attack on children. So yes, same page. Every American from across the political spectrum should 1000% agree and be aware of the fact that there is a direct attack on the American family and largely a war on American children. And we need to incentivize people to have more kids. We need to encourage people to have more kids. We need to make it financially more accessible for families to thrive. And we need to be answering the question of why IVF is needed in the first place, why our fertility is absolutely plummeting over the last several decades. I'll come back to that, I promise. But in the meantime, I've been thinking about how I would respond to this over the last several days, and I was hesitant to say something right away toward the end of the week after all of this blew up on social media. But I think there's a lot of wisdom in what many of my fellow content creators and podcasters have been saying in response. Lila Rose put out this tweet a couple of days ago. Trump just announced his administration would either pay for IVF with tax dollars or force all insurance companies to cover it. Only 7% of embryos created via IVF will result in a live birth. Correct. And I want to come back to that at the end. The remaining 93% of which are frozen indefinitely, miscarried, or aborted. Over 1 million human embryos are already frozen from these IVF procedures. How is this any morally different than the contraceptive mandate under Obama? I promised that we were going to come back to the bioethics side of everything and what percentage of IVF children are born, and we will at the end of this conversation. But I want you to focus on that last sentence in Lila's tweet. How is this morally different than the contraceptive mandate under Obama? If you're not old enough to remember this, or you weren't paying attention to politics as much when this happened, years ago in the Obama administration, they tried to issue a similar mandate that either taxpayers through the government and government-funded healthcare like Medicare and Medicaid, or health insurance companies would be mandated to cover all costs for contraceptives. And at the time, this was wildly controversial. Several groups got involved and sued the government over this. If I remember correctly, a nun organization, the Little Sisters of the Poor, sued over this. And again, I might be getting some of my details wrong. This was several years ago. But basically, the argument that was being made was, if it is against my values-based worldview, religious or otherwise, and I am fundamentally against contraception, you cannot force my company, you cannot force my organization, or you cannot force me as a taxpayer to cover the cost of contraceptives for someone else. That violates the First Amendment to the Constitution of the United States, my freedom of religion and my freedom of my values. Interesting conversation that had happened years and years ago, but honestly ties in 100% to what Trump is trying to institute with IVF, or at least suggesting he wants to, should he be elected president of the United States again. Should it morally be viewed as different to force taxpayers or insurance companies to pay for free contraceptives or to pay for IVF? I don't think it should be. And particularly when there are deep moral, ethical questions related to the use of such technology, either contraception or IVF, that is a clear violation of the First Amendment to the Constitution of the United States. Michael Knowles attempted to make a similar argument then on Twitter on the same day, August 29th, late last week. He reminded us that the two largest religious groups in the United States, the Roman Catholic Church and the Southern Baptist Convention, both formally oppose IVF. This is brand new, by the way. The Catholic Church, as a global institution, as a Catholic universal institution, has been opposed to IVF since the technology's inception 40 years ago. But the Southern Baptist Convention, which is the single largest denomination of Protestant Christians in the United States of America, just recently formally opposed IVF as a technology and said, our church, our organization, does not support this technology. It goes against God's design for life. Michael says many other Americans also reject it as immoral. It seems ill-advised for a political campaign to mandate that so many likely voters support something they consider gravely evil. Ooh, that's good. Ill-advised for a political campaign to mandate something that your base largely has some ethical questions and moral conundrums about. And Michael later went on to remind his followers, as a practical matter, most people created through IVF are destroyed or frozen indefinitely. Again, we'll come back to that. Additionally, IVF establishes the domination of technology over the origin and destiny of human life, asserts a perverse right to a child, and severs the unitive from the procreative. Interestingly, as all of this has been happening with Donald Trump and the political argument and Republicans and Democrats and conservatives and liberals and everybody all talking about IVF, also this week, there's been an emerging story about IVF, about a new lawsuit that's happening in California where an IVF clinic is being sued by multiple couples for destroying their children in their embryonic form when they were kept in the freezer. If you're confused about all of the specifics of what these lawsuits typically look like, I would encourage you to go back and watch our stream from a few months ago about the lawsuit that went all the way up to the Alabama State Supreme Court in a very similar situation where embryos had been destroyed and parents sued the clinic and later went up to the Alabama State Supreme Court to make the argument that that was the wrongful death of their children, that they wanted those children to be able to grow in the womb and be born into healthy babies, and because they were destroyed in the clinic, the state or the clinic was responsible for the wrongful death of those minors. Interesting lawsuit that now seems to be replicated in California. Kristen Hawkins, president and founder of Students for Life and dear friend of mine, tweeted this also on August 29th last week. An IVF clinic in California is being sued by multiple couples for destroying their children in the embryonic form, then implanting the dead, destroyed babies into the wombs of their mothers, even while knowing they were not alive. The attorney stated for some of these victims, this was their last chance to have a biologically related child. This is what happens in the Wild West of the unregulated IVF industry. So all of that's happening at the same time as all of the political back and forth. We're seeing the second major lawsuit unfold in America over what constitutes personhood. Are embryos genetically unique human beings that have never existed before and will never exist again, kept in essentially a purgatory state of perpetual frozen status in a freezer somewhere? Are those people? Are those unique human beings, and should they have the same rights under law as any other human being? And if someone destroys those embryos, should they be legally held responsible for the destruction of that life? I think one thing has been overwhelmingly clear throughout this process, and it's that we have a lot more questions about this technology with every passing day than we do answers. And that's not to say that IVF cannot be used in an ethical and responsible way. I personally am not a fan of the practice, and I personally, as a Catholic in particular, think that it does go against the unitive and procreative role of sexual intimacy in creating a new human life. But I can absolutely understand where there is an ethical and responsible path to use IVF. For example, if you only create one embryo or two embryos and you insert both of those embryos into the woman's uterus and you hope that both of them take at the same time, but you're not creating like dozens and dozens and dozens of children that will always be held in a freezer for the rest of their life. There are absolutely ethical ways to get around some of this. But the more we start to ask this question, the more I think people are realizing that intentionally the powers that be are trying to get us not to ask the question in the first place. Alex Clark, an old friend of mine from Turning Point USA, tweeted last week that she received a message from a fertility nurse, an RN, who told her something wildly disturbing about IVF. Fertility RN here. My patient today, this was August 31st, 3 days ago, got 37 eggs during her retrieval, 28 of which can be fertilized and probably will be in the IVF process. So that's 28 embryos that will be created and put in a freezer and a few of them implanted into her at a time. If 75% of those make it to the blastocyst stage and can be implanted, that is still an astronomical amount of frozen embryos that will someday be discarded. Alex followed this up by saying, yes, through IVF, beautiful life can be created, but also a lot of beautiful lives lost or purposefully destroyed. And why would they be destroyed? Well, the last time we saw Donald Trump talking about IVF back in April, when all of this was getting really confusing on the campaign trail, Allie Beth Stuckey, or as you guys might know her, the host of Relatable with the Blaze, or the conservative millennial, reminded people that IVF inherently, regardless of what you think about the practice, involves eugenics. Because your embryo is always analyzed for who will have the greatest genetic chance of survival and the least likelihood of birth defects or chromosomal abnormalities like Down syndrome. And those embryos are always discarded, usually en masse. She said in April, IVF involves eugenics, the indefinite freezing of embryos, and the mass discarding of embryos. And essentially, at the time when Donald Trump seemed to be universally supporting it, it is not a pro-life statement to say that you support IVF. You might agree with that. You might disagree with that. But I think more than anything, I, in particular, as a scientist by education who never really thought about the moral implications of IVF, over the last 6 months have been on quite the journey in understanding why I think it makes so many people uncomfortable to have the conversation to begin with. And it is precisely because this conversation is uncomfortable that we should have it in the first place, that it's imperative we have it in the first place. Because it forces us to ask the question, just because we can, should we? Or just because we are there more responsible and more ethical ways to be handling the practice? Again, if you want my personal opinion on IVF in length, I highly encourage you to go back and watch those other 2 streams we've done over the last several months on my channel. But namely, I want you to know this. No matter how a child is brought into the world, no matter their circumstances of conception, if they were conceived in marriage or not, if they were conceived in consensual sex or not, if they were conceived inside of a woman's body or inside of a petri dish, every single human being is equally worthy of dignity, of protection, and of life, if only because we are all human beings. Period. Full stop. And our worth is not determined by someone else's concept of our personhood or our circumstances of conception. But if we believe that, and I certainly believe that as an unapologetic pro-life individual from womb to tomb, as they say, then we have to believe that universally. Then I have to believe that a child who was created 40 years ago that is still sitting in a freezer today, of which there are hundreds of thousands, if not millions of those individuals that we know of in freezers in the United States of America as we are having this conversation. That individual is equally worthy of protection and dignity and life as anyone else. And are we really okay with promoting an industry that allows for the eugenics, the experimentation upon, again, go back and watch those streams, or the mass discarding of individuals because they didn't make the cut? Or because, oops, we made too much. Makes me think of the Lululemon website. When you're looking for stuff on sale, they have a whole section of the Lululemon website. Oops, we made too much. They discount them. Are we okay with discounting a human being simply because we made too much? Or because they might have Down syndrome? Or because they might have a physical abnormality? Or because they might be a different gender than what people are wanting to select through IVF, which happens way more than you think, a la Paris Hilton. Or any other reason under the sun. I'm not okay with that. And I'm certainly not okay with living in a country that forces taxpayers to fund that practice, to fund that technology with their hard-earned dollars, knowing that they are contributing to the mass discarding of human life in the process. I think my message to the Trump campaign would be really simple in this process. A, thank you, Trump campaign and President Donald Trump, for speaking out against the horrendous, evil, calculated attack on the American family that is threatening to destroy the very fabric of Western civilization as we know it. Thank you for hearing us. Thank you for paying attention to that. And thank you for trying to ideate innovative ideas for how we can combat that. But I love the way Michael Knowles phrased this. I think it's ill-advised of the Trump campaign to say that the way to our salvation with the attack on the family is through the discarding and destruction intentionally of other people in the process. I think if we're really curious on why fertility is plummeting, let's figure out why fertility is plummeting and try to stop it or reverse it for the next generation, if at all possible. Not slap a Band-Aid solution to create infinite people to put in a freezer in order to be the solution to that. If we're frustrated with why people are wanting to not have kids or they think it's too difficult to have kids, let's talk about the economical reasons people aren't doing that. Let's talk about the cultural reasons people aren't doing that, and the very, very, very obvious indoctrination that's happening in the media and in the government to convince people not to do that and try to change things one day at a time moving forward. But there are deep underlying issues here, morally, ethically, financially, health-related, fertility-wise, that are not being addressed and are much deeper and much more calculated than IVF fixes everything. And those are the questions we desperately need answers to. If IVF has been a part of your family's story, and for many of you it has been, I posted a video on Instagram and on TikTok about this morning and tried to get people's opinions and stories. I'm so glad that there are people here in your life because of amazing technology that made it possible to be here. And if that was your story or your child's story or your niece or nephew or grandson's story, they are worthy, they are dignified, and they are loved and worthy of life simply because they are a human being. I am so glad that those people are here because their life, their worth, their dignity is not determined by their circumstances of conception. But I think society at large does need to start asking the hard questions and having the hard conversations, if only to understand where we can more ethically move forward from here. That's what we promise to do here on the Isabel Brown Show, even when it's difficult to do, even when it's really hard to hear, and even if you might disagree with me in the process. So if you find yourself disagreeing with anything that I've said today, that's okay. That is highly welcomed and encouraged. And I encourage you to leave a message in our chat or in the comments section of this stream as soon as it's done uploading, after we are done being live, because disagreement, discourse, debate is how we thrive as a truly enlightened society, not by pushing our head into the sand and not wanting to offend anybody, but by daring to say the controversial and engage with the controversial in order to bring us truly progressing into a better future for everybody. We are back for the show tomorrow at 3 p.m. Eastern with all kinds of fun things to talk about. Don't forget to smash that follow or subscribe button on your guys' way out. And I love you all very, very, very much. Bye.